scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their toy box. The toys were arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, as if they had been having a meeting while the children slept. Peppa laughed it off, but George noticed that his favorite dinosaur toy was missing its usual cheerful expression. Instead, its plastic eyes seemed to follow him around the room. During breakfast, Mummy Pig announced they would be visiting a new playground that had just opened in town. The family drove through winding roads that seemed to stretch longer than usual, passing the same tree 3 times before finally arriving. The playground was completely empty, which was odd for such a beautiful day. The swings moved gently in the breeze, even though there was no wind. As they explored the playground, Peppa noticed that all the equipment was slightly wrong. The slide was too steep, the monkey bars were too high, and the seesaw balanced perfectly even when no one was on it. George pointed to the sandbox, where tiny handprints appeared in the sand, forming a trail that led to nowhere. The handprints were too small to belong to any child they knew. Daddy Pig suggested they play hide and seek to lighten the mood. Peppa counted to 10 while everyone hid, but when she opened her eyes, the playground had changed. The bright colors had faded to muted grays and browns, and shadows stretched in impossible directions. She called out for her family, but her voice echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed by something unseen. Following the sound of George's giggling, Peppa found herself in a part of the playground she hadn't seen before. The equipment here was made of twisted metal and splintered wood, yet it looked brand new. George was sitting on a swing that moved by itself, his back turned to her. When he finally turned around, his usual smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a way that made Peppa's stomach feel funny. Mummy and Daddy Pig appeared from behind a structure that definitely hadn't been there moments before. They were smiling too, but their eyes remained completely still, never blinking. They spoke in perfect unison, suggesting they all play together forever and ever. The playground began to shift and change around them, with new equipment appearing and disappearing like a living maze. As the sun began to set, though it felt like they had only been there for minutes, Peppa realized that the exit they had used to enter was no longer there. Every path led deeper into the playground, and every game they played seemed to last exactly the same amount of time. The other families that began to arrive all had the same 2 wide smiles and unblinking eyes. The playground's music box melody started playing from speakers hidden throughout the area, a cheerful tune that became more distorted with each repetition. Peppa tried to wake up, thinking this must be a dream, but pinching herself.
Peppa Pig. The drawing that wasn't hers. It all started on an ordinary Sunday morning. The sun had just begun to filter through the curtains, and the room was quiet. Peppa stretched, jumped out of bed, and, as always, walked to her desk. She wanted to draw something for school, but there was already a sheet of paper on the table, perfectly drawn. In the center, the kitchen. She was standing there. George sat at the table. Daddy Pig was pouring tea. Mummy Pig was holding toast in her hoof. Everything looked familiar until one detail. A broken teacup lay on the floor, clearly drawn, with shards, even a drop of tea nearby. "I didn't draw this," whispered Peppa. She glanced around. George was still asleep. Her colored pencils were neatly packed in their box. The paper was clean, unwrinkled. No one could have faked her style, but the handwriting, it felt strangely familiar. At breakfast, she said nothing. She just remembered the scene, and everything happened exactly the same. Daddy Pig's exact words, "The morning starts with tea." Mummy's same smile, and the teacup slipping and shattering on the floor, just like in the drawing. "Coincidence," she mumbled, but her heart beat faster. The next morning, another page. It was already waiting on her desk. The scene, a walk in the yard, George with his ball, she had her kite, and in the background, a puddle she was about to fall into. She tried to avoid it, but everything happened just as in the drawing. Even George's shout was the same. The third drawing was worse. Their bedroom, nighttime, and next to George's bed, a figure, dark, vague, just a silhouette, sketched in soft pencil. Peppa stared at it for a long time. She wanted to tear it up, but her hand wouldn't move. "Who's doing this?" she asked the mirror. "Who's drawing?" That night, she couldn't sleep. She listened to every sound. At 2 a.m., George moaned. She got up, walked over, and saw a shadow at the door, exactly like the one in the drawing. It vanished the moment she blinked. This can't be real. Each day, the drawings got darker. One showed her standing alone, her family behind her, all with empty eyes, and above them, a message. "You didn't notice, but they've changed." She tried hiding the drawings, in a drawer, under the bed, even in the storage room. But every morning, a new sheet was on the table. Always fresh, as if someone placed it there during the night. On the 7th day, she woke up early, waited, lay with her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, and heard it. The soft rustle of paper, a faint wooden creak. Someone was in the room, someone breathing quietly. She opened her eyes. No one there, just the new drawing. In it, herself, sitting at the desk, reading the very drawing she was holding. And behind her, a hand, long, drawn in black chalk. She was turning her head, and the drawing ended there. The final line trembled, as if the artist had been interrupted. Since then, Peppa can't sleep soundly. She's afraid not just of tomorrow morning, but of the one who already knows it, the one drawing her life, step by step, and coming closer, because the last drawing she saw was blank, just one silhouette, faceless, with a message below. "Your turn to draw."
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their cozy yellow house. The sun was shining through their bedroom window, and everything seemed normal. Mummy Pig was making breakfast downstairs, humming her usual cheerful tune. But something was different today, something that none of them could quite put their finger on. As Peppa brushed her teeth, she noticed her reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed to lag behind her movements by just a fraction of a second. When she raised her hand, her reflection followed a moment later. When she smiled, her reflection's smile appeared slightly wider, showing just a few too many teeth. But when she blinked and looked again, everything appeared normal. During breakfast, George kept staring at his favorite dinosaur toy on the kitchen table. The green plastic dinosaur that usually brought him so much joy now seemed to be watching him back. Its painted eyes followed George as he moved around the kitchen, and when no one was looking, George could swear he saw the toy's mouth open and close silently, as if it was trying to say something important. Daddy Pig announced that today they would visit Grandpa Pig's farm, which usually made the children excited. But as they drove through the countryside, the familiar landscape began to change in subtle ways. The trees along the road grew taller and darker, their branches reaching toward the car like gnarled fingers. The cheerful yellow flowers in the fields turned pale and seemed to wilt as they passed by. When they arrived at the farm, Grandpa Pig greeted them with his usual warm smile, but his eyes seemed different somehow. They were darker than usual, almost black, and they never seemed to blink. He led them to see the animals, but the chickens were completely silent, standing motionless in perfect rows. The pigs in the pen had stopped their usual snorting and rolling in mud, instead standing perfectly still and staring at the family with unblinking eyes. The vegetable garden that Grandpa Pig was so proud of had grown overnight into something unrecognizable. The carrots had sprouted into twisted, gnarled shapes that looked more like tiny hands reaching up from the earth. The tomatoes had turned an unnaturally deep red, almost black, and seemed to pulse gently as if they had heartbeats of their own. As the afternoon wore on, more strange things began to happen. The family's shadows on the ground started moving independently, gesturing and pointing in directions that didn't match their owner's movements. When Peppa looked down at her shadow, it waved at her with both hands while she stood perfectly still. George's shadow seemed to be jumping up and down excitedly, even though George himself was sitting quietly on a hay bale. The sky began to change color as evening approached, but instead of the usual orange and pink sunset, it turned a sickly green color that made everyone's skin look pale and strange. The clouds formed shapes that looked almost like faces, watching the family from above with expressions that seemed both sad and hungry. When it was time to go home, the car wouldn't start. Daddy Pig turned the key again and again, but the engine remained silent. As they sat in the car wondering what to do, they noticed that all the farm animals had gathered around the vehicle, forming a perfect circle. The chickens, pigs, sheep, and even Grandpa Pig's old horse stood motionless, staring at the family through the car windows with those same dark, unblinking eyes. Grandpa Pig approached the car with that same strange smile, tapping gently on the window. When Daddy Pig rolled it down, Grandpa Pig leaned in close and whispered something that made all the adults go very quiet and pale. The children couldn't hear what he said, but they noticed that his breath smelled like old earth and forgotten things. Suddenly, the car engine roared to life on its own, and they drove away quickly. But as they looked back through the rear window, they could see Grandpa Pig and all the animals still standing in that perfect circle, watching them disappear into the distance. And in the growing darkness, it seemed like there were many more figures standing behind them, shapes that hadn't been there before. When they finally reached home, everything appeared normal again. The house was warm and bright, and Mummy Pig made them hot chocolate before bed. But that night, as Peppa and George lay in their beds, they could hear soft scratching sounds coming from inside the walls, as if something was trying to get in. And when they looked out their bedroom window, they could see dark shapes moving in the garden, shapes that looked almost like the animals from Grandpa Pig's farm, waiting patiently in the moonlight. The next morning, everything was back to normal, and the family never spoke about their strange day at the farm again. But sometimes, when Peppa looked in mirrors, she still noticed that her reflection smiled just a little too wide, showing just a few too many teeth. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their bedroom. The toys that usually sat peacefully on their shelves had moved during the night, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. Peppa thought it was just George playing a silly game, but George insisted he had been sleeping all night. The next morning, Mummy Pig found all the family photos turned face down on the mantelpiece. When she flipped them back up, the faces in the pictures had changed. Everyone was smiling, but their eyes were completely black, like empty holes staring back at her. Daddy Pig laughed it off as a trick of the light, but Mummy Pig felt a chill run down her spine. That afternoon, while playing in the garden, Peppa noticed their reflections in the pond were moving differently than they were. When she waved her hand, her reflection waved back a few seconds later. When George jumped, his reflection stayed perfectly still, just staring up at them with those same black eyes from the photographs. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner, but something was terribly wrong. The food on their plates kept changing when they looked away. Carrots became tiny fingers, peas turned into small eyes that blinked slowly, and the gravy moved like it was alive, forming shapes and patterns that spelled out words they couldn't quite read. During bedtime, Peppa heard whispers coming from inside the walls. The voices sounded like her family, but they were saying things backwards, speaking in a language that made her feel dizzy and confused. George started crying, pointing at the corner of their room where a shadow stood. Even though there was nothing there to cast it, the shadow began to grow larger, stretching across the ceiling and down the walls. It moved independently of any light source, reaching toward their beds with long, dark fingers. Peppa grabbed George's hand as they watched their own shadows on the wall begin to move on their own, mimicking the movements of the strange shadow creature. Suddenly, all the toys in their room came to life, but not in a friendly way. Their teddy bears turned their heads to stare at the children with button eyes that had become real, blinking and following their every movement. The toy dinosaur that George loved so much opened its plastic mouth to reveal rows of tiny, sharp teeth. The children ran downstairs to find their parents, but Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting at the kitchen table, perfectly still, with those same black eyes from the photographs. They turned their heads in unison to look at Peppa and George, their smiles too wide, stretching beyond what should be possible. The house itself seemed to be changing around them. Doors appeared where walls used to be, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. The stairs multiplied, creating an endless spiral that went up and down simultaneously. The windows showed not the familiar garden outside, but a dark void filled with more shadows reaching toward the glass. As the night grew deeper, Peppa realized that nothing in their world was real anymore. Every familiar object, every beloved toy, every family memory had been replaced by something that only looked the same on the surface. The real question was not how to escape this nightmare, but whether they had ever been real themselves, or if they too were just shadows pretending to be alive.
The scary Peppa Pig episode that never aired on TV late evening at the Pig family house, unusual silence reigned. Mummy Pig finished washing dishes and turned off the light, while Daddy Pig slept in his chair. Peppa and George prepared for bed in their bedroom with the purple bunk bed. George climbed onto the bottom bunk with his dinosaur, while Peppa climbed to the top. But tonight, something was wrong. The bed made strange creaking sounds. Every time Peppa turned, the metal parts creaked eerily. Mummy Pig wished good night and turned off the light. As the room plunged into semi-darkness, the bed began rocking by itself. Peppa felt her bed slowly swaying, as if an invisible hand pushed it. George noticed the movement too. His bed rocked in the opposite direction. The children looked at each other fearfully, deciding it was wind. They tried sleeping, but the swaying continued. At midnight, Peppa was awakened by quiet whispers. "Peppa, Peppa." The voice came from below, but wasn't George's. Peppa looked down. George slept soundly, hugging his dinosaur. The whisper repeated near her ear. "Peppa, come down." She woke George. The boy heard the voice calling him. "George, come up." The children realized something terrible was happening. The voice grew insistent. The bed rocked harder. The ladder began moving by itself, inviting George to climb. Peppa and George huddled together in terror. Strange sounds came from dark corners, grinding, whispering, quiet laughter. Suddenly the bed stopped abruptly. Deathly silence fell. Seconds later they heard footsteps in the corridor. The door creaked open. A dark figure appeared, too tall and thin. It entered and approached the bed. The figure extended a long arm toward the ladder and shook the bed. "Switch places,"